Salam to all of you. I hope you are all in good health and in good spirits. This is lecture 11 of our semester 2 syllabus in contemporary US political thought and foreign policy. Today's lecture is titled The Post-Cold War World Order and American Unipolarism. In this lecture we shall look into the rise of US unipolarism or unipolarity after the end of the Cold War, which also marked the end of bipolarity or the bipolar world. The lecture is divided into 5 sections. In section 1, I shall introduce, identify and define the key terminology, most notably bipolarism, unipolarism, and the New World Order. Section 2 provides a general background and overview of the collapse of communism and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Section 3 presents the theoretical rationale behind the rise of unipolarism or the unipolar world system. In section 4 we look into the development of US unipolarity into what we can call Pax Americana, that was marked by the rise of the United States as an uncompromising hegemon. And we shall round up the lecture with some closing remarks by way of a brief transition to our next lecture, which is going to be our last lecture for this semester. I shall also present you with the assigned reading for this week. Let's start by seeing how the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, which was to bring the Cold War to an end, came about. On the 9th of November 1989, tens of thousands of East Germans breached parts of the Berlin Wall to cross over to West Berlin. The fall of the wall marked the beginning of the official end of the Cold War. It signaled the reunification of Germany and the beginning of the end of the ideological division of Europe. That represented the symbolic moment of the end of the bipolar world and the rise of a unipolar world, which simply meant the cessation of the balance of power world system. We shall come back to these concepts with definition and explanation in a little bit. Slowly recovering from the dazzling shock to see the Soviet Union disintegrate like a castle of cards, George Bush Sr. announced the advent of what he called a New World Order. He wasn't yet sure how it would look like, because his intelligence services were not able to predict how quick the collapse would be. The Cold War officially ended when all the communist governments of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union fell apart. That happened between 1989 and 1991. The Soviet Union looked helpless as its geopolitical position was eroding. With its aggravated domestic crisis and acute economic stagnation and chaos, pessimism and discontent had become the order of the day. The country's economic and financial meltdown was due in large part to the intensive and costly arms race the Soviet Union had been engaged in with the United States for decades. By 1991, it found itself practically unable to keep the economy on its feet and at the same time maintain the traditionally high-level military spending so as to be able to keep up with the United States. The pro-Soviet regimes which had been in place in Eastern Europe since the end of the Second World War were actually falling one after the other. Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria. In 1991, the Soviet Union actually completely disintegrated as a country and was replaced by as many as 15 new independent states. You can see that on the map. are here. Now, what were the major causes of the collapse of the Soviet Union and of communism? You can say there were three major reasons which led to the collapse of communism and with it the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of those reasons was the fact that the Soviet Union had been enduring a profound socio-economic crisis for a long time. And that obviously provoked a lot of discontent and unrest and a lot of agitation in the Soviet society and the Soviet Union as a country as a whole. There was also the rise of dissenting social movements in the countries of Eastern Europe in reaction to the failing economic policies of those communist regimes. And we shouldn't, of course, forget the growing dissatisfaction with the policies of the communist governments and their very poor record with regard to civil and political rights. In the late 1980s, there emerged new and more assertive political movements demanding regime change in Eastern Europe. I shall try here to briefly define the key terminology that I shall be referring to in this lecture. Let's first try to understand what we mean by the post-Cold War New World Order, and what we mean by unipolarism or unipolarity, and by bipolarism and bipolarity. So the first to use the concept New World Order was actually President George Bush Sr. He used it in the context of the upcoming First Gulf War, which we shall address in our next lecture. He used the term to justify his decision to go to war against what he presented as a rogue country, threatening both American and world security. He promised, quote, "A new world order where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind, peace and security, freedom and the rule of law," unquote. But contrary to that promise, the New World Order was to become an apparatus in the hands of an aggressive hegemon, which was the United States, which itself became, in the eyes of its own allies, a threat to world peace and security, squashing any country which didn't conform to its one-sided vision of the New World Order, or which tried to alert the world as to Washington's hidden agenda. The end of the Cold War led to a new era in world relations characterized by unipolarity or unipolarism. That is, a world dominated by one single great power, or if you want, hyperpower, which is the United States. As the sole superpower, the United States emerged as the global hegemon, more powerful than any other country in the world, militarily, economically, politically, and culturally. There is a host of other concepts which I shall introduce and explain along the way as we move on in this lecture and in the coming one. Now, with the end of the Cold War, the United States found itself in need of a new intellectual, or if you want, ideological rationale to validate the new course its foreign policy was to take. U.S. foreign policy and political thought had traditionally been framed by the notion of antagonism with an enemy, or a threatening ideology coming from outside. The fear factor has always been at the center of its development strategy, from the westward movement that gave it its first empire, to the conquest of the Western Hemisphere, which gave it its second empire, and to its post-World War II non-territorial empire in Europe. Its policy had always been anchored on the existence of what we might call a boogeyman. The sudden collapse of the USSR and communism generally left the United States without an ideological adversary, or if you want, a proverbial enemy which could justify the tight grip it had over Europe. European voices actually started to question the raison d'être of the US heavy military presence in the old continent. They also questioned the very existence of NATO, especially after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. To fill this void and help revamp their strategy vis-à-vis the new reality of world power relations, and especially preserve the gains obtained since World War II, US foreign policy makers needed a new theoretical rationale. This was to be provided by two political scientists through two groundbreaking theories which were to shape the intellectual capital for US foreign policy for the next 2 or 3 decades. These were Francis Fukuyama with his end of history theory and Samuel Huntington with his clash of civilizations theory. Now, Fukuyama considered that the end of the Cold War signaled not just the end of a historical era, but the end of history itself. And that was what he called liberal capitalist democracy, or if you want, global capitalism, which in his opinion triumphed as the ultimate model of governance for all mankind. He contended that humanity had reached the final stage of its development with the Western capitalist model of political economy. He also argued that the subsequent rise of the United States as a unipolar superpower would set the world on the road of durable peace and prosperity. Now, in hindsight, we know that he got it all wrong. The world was far from being on the end of history. And as we shall see in this lecture and in the coming one, the events that dovetailed what came to be known as the American Unipolar Moment would testify to a totally different reality. Yet, for many years, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Fukuyama's essay was to become a must-read for US political officials. And many of the policies the United States adopted in the post-Cold War era were in fact inspired by these premises that he developed in his essay. And as we said earlier, the second premise that was to shape the theoretical rationale for US foreign policy strategy following the end of the Cold War was Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations. Huntington conceded that the source of all the future collision and divisions between human beings across the world would originate neither in ideology nor in the economy, but in culture. He warned American Western leaders that Western culture is unique but not universal, and that both the Islamic civilization and what he called the Confucian, which means the Chinese culture, could be a source of threat to the West and could seriously challenge Western civilization. The most significant feature of the New World Order, or what came to be known as the unipolar world or the unipolar moment and so on, that came after the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, was the rise of the United States as the aggressive hyperpower. As the sole superpower, it behaved as a confrontational hegemon, often uncompromising and violent. US unipolarism, or the American Unipolar Moment, dominated the international power relations system roughly between 1991, that is the year the Soviet Union disintegrated, and 2008-2009, when the financial crisis hit the US economy pretty severely. As the antagonistic hegemon, the United States felt freer to use its military power than ever before. It assumed a confrontational posture to preserve its hegemonic position. As we shall see in our next lecture, it was to turn into a Pax Americana, asserting power through force and coercion. the United States at times found itself superseding the United Nations itself and its Security Council in handling international conflicts. As you know, under international law, the UN Security Council is the only recognized body with the authority to act as arbiter in international crises and to authorize the use of force. But as the global hegemon, the United States often disregarded the United Nations and disregarded the UN Security Council, giving itself the right to act as the only arbiter of conflicts across the world and as the unilateral discharger of military force at a global scale. It must be borne in mind that such crises were often instigated by America itself. And when those crises were finally solved according to its own preferences, the countries in question would eventually fall under its domination. Unlike older unipolar powers, which had been regional in scope and influence, post-Cold War America developed into the first global hegemon the world had ever seen. As an aggressive global hegemon, the United States, as we shall see in our coming lecture in some detail, wouldn't hesitate to use its military muscles, the power of the dollar, political influence, and also media and communications supremacy to impose its agenda on the rest of the world. In our coming lecture, we shall look into the major features of American unipolarism. We shall highlight the mechanisms through which the United States exerted its hegemonic power. These included the different processes associated with globalization, economic, cultural, media and communication, and especially global military interventions, both covert and overt. We shall explore what's tipped to be the end of the American Unipolar Moment and the advent of what is called a multipolar world, set forth by, quote-unquote, the rise of the rest. That's a fast-growing China and perhaps a recovering Russia. We shall try to navigate the different perspectives regarding the competition which seems to be gaining momentum between these emerging powers and the United States at the global stage. We shall also touch on how the current coronavirus pandemic is affecting the US position in the world as compared with its direct rivals. Now, concerning the assigned reading for this week, and in addition to Fukuyama's The End of History and Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations, which you were assigned at the beginning of the semester, today we have two journal articles which I have made available for you on the platform. This is it for this week. I hope you stay healthy and you stay safe.